The autumn of 1887 had settled over Bitter Creek territory, like a shroud painting the endless expanse of prairie grass in shades of copper and gold that stretched beyond the horizon until they melted into the vast Montana sky. It was a land that swallowed men whole, a place where dreams came to die beneath the relentless sun, and where the wind carried whispers of broken promises across miles of untamed wilderness. Behind Murphy's General Store, where the scent of tobacco and leather mingled with the acrid smell of kerosene, a transaction was taking place that would change 3 lives forever. The ramshackle building cast long shadows in the dying light, and inside the cramped back room the air hung thick with desperation and shame. Clara Beth Morrison sat hunched on the dirt floor, her wrists raw from the iron shackles her own mother had clamped around them not an hour before. At barely 19, she carried the weight of 8 months with child, her swollen belly straining against the worn calico dress that had seen better days when the railroads first pushed west. Her auburn hair, once the pride of her appearance, now hung in tangled strands around a face that had learned too young what cruelty looked like when it wore a familiar face. 8 months gone, and you ain't even thought she needs a doctor, came a voice from the shadows, low, gravelly, weathered like the man who spoke it. Jeremiah Jed Coulter stepped into the pale circle of lamplight, his boots making no sound on the packed earth floor. He was a man carved from the territory itself, tall and lean as a lodgepole pine, with hands that spoke of decades spent wresting life from unforgiving soil. His face bore the deep lines that came not from laughter, but from squinting into too many sunsets while searching for something that might never come. "She needs a husband, not a damn sawbones," spat Mattie Morrison. Clara's mother shifting her considerable weight from one mud-caked boot to the other. Her face was a road map of hard-living lips cracked from whiskey and winter's eyes that had long since stopped seeing beauty in anything. "A man like you ought to know the difference between doctoring and husbanding." Jed's pale blue eyes never settled on Clara directly, but seemed to look through her as if he were seeing ghosts in the rough-hewn walls behind her. "I don't need a wife," he said quietly, his voice carrying the exhaustion of a man who had spoken these words to himself countless times. "I need quiet." The exchange was completed with the efficiency of a cattle trade. 2 silver dollars Mexican pesos worn smooth by countless hands, 1 jug of corn whiskey that sloshed amber in the lamplight, and a promissory note scratched on brown paper for half a butchered steer come November. Mattie unlatched the shackles with the same care she might show, untying a grain sack, then shoved Clara toward the door with a grunt. "Don't give him trouble," she muttered, not meeting her daughter's eyes. "He paid more than you're worth, which ain't saying much." Jed Coulter didn't touch. Clara didn't even offer his hand as she struggled to her feet. He simply nodded toward the door, where his horse waited, a sturdy buckskin mare whose flanks gleamed with sweat in the fading light. The animal had the patient look of a creature accustomed to long journeys across difficult country. Clara climbed onto the horse with deliberate slowness, her pride the only thing left that truly belonged to her. Her throat burned with unshed tears, but she had learned long ago that tears were a luxury she couldn't afford. They rode in silence through the gathering dusk, 3 miles of dust-choked trails that wound between stands of ponderosa pine, whose shadows seemed to breathe with the evening wind. The Coulter homestead sat at the edge of nowhere, where the cultivated world gave way to wild country that stretched unbroken to the Canadian border. No neighbors' lights twinkled in the distance, no fence lines marked the boundaries of civilization, just raw land and a weathered cabin that looked like it hadn't heard human laughter in a decade. Reform. Chapter 2. The House of Ghosts. Jed helped Clara down from the horse with careful efficiency, his touch brief and impersonal. The cabin before them told a story of solitude, well-built but austere, with a wide porch that faced west toward the mountains. Evening shadows pooled beneath the eaves like dark water. Inside, the air was clean, in a way that spoke of absence rather than care. No scent of tobacco lingered in the corners, no trace of perfume or cooking spices, only the ghosts of wood smoke and lemon oil. A single photograph hung slightly askew over the stone mantelpiece, showing a woman with luminous dark eyes and delicate hands wrapped around an empty baby blanket. The child who should have filled that blanket was nowhere to be seen. "You can take the room there," Jed said, indicating a door to the left of the main room. His voice was carefully neutral, as if he were directing a stranger to the nearest water trough. "The bed's firm. There's fresh water by the stove morning and evening. I won't come in without knocking first." Clara nodded once her fingers instinctively moving to the hidden fold in her boot, where she had sewn a thin blade during her last desperate night in her mother's house. The room beyond the door smelled of lavender and abandonment, a scent that spoke of hope deferred rather than hope destroyed. The bed was covered with a wedding ring quilt, too fine for the rustic surroundings, its intricate pattern speaking of patient hands and dreams stitched in silk thread. On the dresser sat a silver-backed brush, a small mirror with an ornate frame, and a pair of women's shoes that had never known the touch of prairie dust. They were artifacts of a life-interrupted museum pieces in a shrine to what might have been. That first night, long after the coyotes began their mournful song to the star-scattered sky, Clara lay awake, with one hand pressed to her belly, where the child moved restlessly, the other wrapped around the bone handle of her hidden blade. She listened for footsteps that never came, for sounds of movement from the main room that might signal danger. Instead, she heard only the wind playing through the eaves, and the occasional creak of old timber settling into sleep. Around midnight, restlessness drove her from the bed. Moving with the careful silence of someone accustomed to avoiding notice, she crept barefoot toward the front of the house, the knife hidden in the folds of her nightgown. The main room was empty, but light flickered beyond the windows. Clara eased the front door open and stepped onto the porch where autumn rain had begun to fall in whispers against the wooden boards. There, kneeling beside an overturned saddle, was Jed Coulter. By the light of a guttering oil lamp, he was threading new leather through a torn stirrup, his weathered hands moving with the patience of a man who had learned to find peace in simple tasks. The rain soaked his shirt and dripped from his graying hair, but he seemed oblivious to the cold. As he worked, he spoke softly to the empty air. "She always said this place needed mending," his voice barely audible above the rain. She meant more than just the fences. Clara stood frozen in the doorway, the blade hanging forgotten at her side. This was not the predator she had prepared herself to face, but something far more dangerous, a broken man who had found his own way to survive. He looked up suddenly, seeing her silhouetted against the lamplight from within the house. Their eyes met across the rain-darkened porch, and in that moment Clara saw not threat, but recognition, the look of one lost soul acknowledging another. Couldn't sleep," he said simply, neither question nor judgment in his voice. Clara shook her head, water running down her face like tears she wouldn't allow herself to shed. Jed nodded once, and returned to his work stitching leather through the quiet night. Back in her room, Clara slid the knife beneath her pillow, not from trust, not yet, but from something more complex, something that hurt less than the fear she had carried for so long. In the morning, she woke to find warm biscuits and wild honey waiting on the kitchen table. No note, no explanation, just sustenance offered without expectation of gratitude. For the first time in months, the silence around her wasn't heavy with threat, but simply still. Chapter 3. The Portrait's Witness. The morning sun filtering through the lace curtains of Clara's room painted shifting patterns across the hand-stitched quilt, and with it came the gradual revelation of details she had missed in the darkness. The unfinished embroidery on the windowsill showed a garden scene roses climbing a trellis with the needle still threaded, as if the seamstress had only stepped away for a moment. Beside it lay a leather-bound book of psalms, its pages soft with frequent turning. The portrait on the far wall drew Clara's attention, like a magnet draws iron. The woman in the photograph appeared to be no older than Clara herself, with dark hair swept back in the Gibson girl style, and eyes that held a quality of patient waiting. She wasn't smiling. Frontier photographers rarely captured smiles, but neither did she look sad. She simply looked as if she were listening for something just beyond the frame. In the days that followed, Clara began to understand the rhythm of her new life. Each morning brought the sound of Jed moving quietly through the house before dawn, feeding the animals and checking the property's far boundaries. When she emerged from her room, she would find evidence of his care: fresh cornbread wrapped in clean cloth, a kettle already singing on the wood stove, sometimes extra firewood stacked beside the door when the autumn chill crept through the walls. He spoke little, acknowledging her presence with a nod when their paths crossed in the kitchen or on the porch. At night, the only sounds were the steady tick of the mantel clock and the whisper of burning wood settling into ash. Clara had lived in houses where shouting filled every corner, where hunger stalked the rooms, like a living thing where silence was sharp-edged and threatening. But this silence was different. It didn't watch her with suspicion or judge her condition. It simply allowed her to exist. One afternoon, as autumn clouds gathered low over the valley and the wind carried the scent of coming snow, a sharp knock shattered Clara's fragile sense of peace. She had been peeling carrots by the kitchen window, watching a hawk circle high above the pasture, when the sound came like gunfire against the wooden door. Jed answered, before Clara could move his hand resting casually on the Colt revolver that rode his hip, a habit so ingrained he seemed unaware of it. On the porch stood a woman in severe black dress and bonnet, her boots caked with the red mud that marked the road from town. Her face had the pinched look of someone who had spent years feeding on other people's misfortunes. Widow Blackwood. Jed said, his voice carrying no warmth. "Sarah, I came for eggs," the woman replied sharply, her eyes sliding past Jed to fix on Clara with the intensity of a bird of prey spotting movement in tall grass. "And to see this girl you've brought into decent country." Clara instinctively stepped back from the window, but there was no hiding the curve of her belly beneath her apron. The child chose that moment to kick, as if responding to the tension that filled the room like smoke. "Well, I declare," Sarah Blackwood hissed, her hands settling on her narrow hips. "Ain't she ripe as a September apple, barely grown herself and already swelled up like a prize sow? What's the matter, Jed Coultertown getting too quiet without a proper scandal to chew on?" Jed didn't move from the doorway, his face carved from stone. Clara's fingers tightened around the paring knife, and she felt the familiar flutter of panic in her chest, the same feeling that had driven her to sew a blade into her boot. "She, your new pet project." The widow continued, venom dripping from every word. "Didn't take you long after burying poor Mary, did it? Bringing in some barefoot hussy from the mining camps. You always did have a taste for the young ones." Clara felt the words hit her like physical blows, each one designed to strip away what little dignity she had managed to preserve. But Jed's response was not what she expected. He simply turned, walked into the kitchen with measured steps, and returned carrying a small basket filled with brown eggs, still warm from the hens. "You wanted eggs," he said, extending the basket without expression. "Take them." Sarah Blackwood snatched the offering, her eyes still burning holes through Clara. "She won't last, you know," she said with obvious satisfaction. "Trash never does. They always go back to where they came from." Jed stepped back and placed one weathered hand on the doorframe. Without raising his voice or showing any emotion, he closed the door with a soft click that seemed to echo through the sudden silence. Clara stood motionless for a long moment after the widow's departure, her hands trembling as she set down the knife. She waited for Jed to explain, to apologize, to tell her that Sarah Blackwood's words were lies, born of small-town malice. Instead, he walked past her to the porch, settled into his usual chair, and began whittling a piece of cedar with the same steady patience he brought to all his tasks. He had not defended her. He had not denied the accusations. He had simply closed the door and returned to his routine as if nothing had happened. That night, Clara sat on the edge of her bed, brushing out her hair in front of the small mirror. Behind her, the portrait of Mary Coulter seemed to watch with patient understanding. "He's more afraid of their words than mine," Clara whispered to the photograph, and in speaking the words aloud, she understood something fundamental about the man who had bought her freedom at the cost of his reputation. He had not brought her here to save her. He had brought her here because he had stopped believing in his own worth. Ghosts were easier companions than living people because the dead could not disappoint or abandon you. But Clara was not a ghost, and neither was the child she carried. They were still alive, still fighting, still hoping for something better than mere survival. Act 2. The Crucible of Fire and Blood. Chapter 4. Roots in Barren Ground. The wind that howled across the Montana Territory that October night carried with it the promise of an early winter and the scent of change. Clara lay in her bed, every muscle tense, as the house creaked and settled around her like an old man's bones. She had been counting days, nearly 3 weeks since the transaction behind Murphy's store, and with each passing dawn, the weight of her situation had grown heavier than the child in her womb. Jed Coulter had kept his word about not entering her room, uninvited had provided food and shelter, without asking for anything in return. But the silence between them had begun to feel less like respect and more like the calm before a storm. Clara had learned to read the signs of danger in a man's behavior, and lately she sensed something shifting in the rhythm of their careful coexistence. She rose without lighting the oil lamp, dressing quietly in the heavy wool coat Jed had left hanging on the door, one of his late wife's garments she suspected altered to fit her changing shape. The blade she had sewn into her boot pressed against her ankle, like a cold reminder that freedom always came with a price that must be paid in blood or courage. The back door opened without protest, onto a night that bit at exposed skin with teeth of ice and wind. Snow had begun to fall, not the gentle flakes of a Christmas card, but hard pellets that stung the face and promised a blizzard before morning. Clara pulled her shawl tight and stepped into the storm, her boots crunching through the thin crust that had already formed over the hard-packed earth. She had no destination in mind, only the desperate need to move to feel like she had some control over her fate. The wind pushed at her back, as if urging her forward away from the cabin, and the silent man who lived there away from the whispers and judgments of people like Sarah Blackwood, away from everything that reminded her of how completely her life had been stripped of choice. But the child had other plans. A sudden twist of pain in her side stopped Clara mid-step, forcing her to grab the split rail fence for support. The contraction was sharp and unexpected, nothing like the gentle movements she had grown accustomed to. She gasped, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air, and pressed her free hand to the tight curve of her belly. "No," she whispered into the wind. "Not now. Please, not now." Another pain hit lower and stronger, dropping her to her knees in the snow. The cold bit through her dress, but it was nothing compared to the fear that gripped her heart. She was alone, miles from the nearest doctor, with only a taciturn stranger who owed her nothing and had no reason to care if she lived or died. The sound of running footsteps cut through the wind, and then Jed's voice rough with urgency. "Clara!" She tried to answer but couldn't find her breath. The pain was building like a thunderstorm, each wave stronger than the last. Then his hands were under her arms, lifting her with surprising strength, her body pressed against the wool of his coat that smelled of horse and pine smoke. He carried her not back to the house, but to the small barn where the animals sheltered from the storm. Inside it was warmer and quieter, protected from the wind by thick walls and the presence of the cattle and horses. Jed laid her gently on a bed of fresh hay, then lit a lantern that cast dancing shadows on the rough wooden walls. "How long?" he asked, kneeling beside her as another contraction seized her body. "Started just now," Clara managed through gritted teeth. I wanted to." "I know," Jed said quietly, his weathered hand resting on her shoulder. "But don't let your child die because of what people say. Don't let fear make that choice for you." His words hit her like lightning in a clear sky. She stared at him through the pain, seeing for the first time not the silent stranger who had purchased her like livestock, but a man who understood what it meant to lose everything that mattered. The labor continued through the darkest hours of the night, with Jed acting as midwife with a competence that spoke of hard experience. He brought water from the house, tore strips from clean cloth, and spoke to Clara in low, steady tones that anchored her to consciousness when the pain threatened to drag her under. "Tell me about before," he said during one of the quieter moments between contractions. "Tell me how this started." Clara's first instinct was to refuse. The story was too shameful, too raw to share with a man she barely knew. But something in his voice, a quality of patient listening that reminded her of a priest in a confessional, loosened the words from her throat. "My mother wanted me to serve drinks in the mining camps." She set her eyes fixed on the barn's rafters where shadows danced in the lantern light. "Pour whiskey and sit on men's laps and smile like it didn't matter that their hands wandered where they shouldn't. The miners paid better if the girl was young and pretty." She paused as another wave of pain washed over her, then continued with the dogged determination of someone who had decided to tell the whole truth no matter the cost. "I said no. Just once, just stood up and said I wouldn't do it anymore. She locked me in the root cellar for 3 days with nothing but water and moldy bread. After that, I learned to keep my mouth shut and do what I was told." Jed said nothing, but his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I ran away when I turned 18. Found work in Copper Falls cleaning rooms at a boarding house. That's where I met him, the baby's father. He was kind at first, treated me like I was something precious instead of something to be used. But kindness has a price, too, I learned. When I told him about the baby, he looked at me like I'd just told him I had the plague." Clara's voice grew smaller, more fragile. "I don't even know if he knows I'm gone. Don't know if I want him to." Jed nodded once, a gesture that somehow conveyed both understanding and acceptance. Then he rose, added another log to the small fire he had built in an old metal bucket, and left her to rest between the waves of labor that were growing stronger and closer together. Near dawn, when the snow had stopped falling, and the world beyond the barn had grown still as a held breath, Clara felt the final change beginning. The pain was different now, purposeful rather than merely destructive, as if her body had finally remembered what it was supposed to do. "Jed," she called, and he was there instantly, as if he had been waiting just outside the circle of lamplight. What followed was a blur of pain and effort, and desperate hope punctuated by Jed's steady voice, telling her to breathe, to push, to hold on just a little longer. And then, cutting through the sound of wind and settling timbers, came another voice, high and thin and utterly alive. A baby's cry filled the barn, fierce and uncompromising, the sound of something that had fought its way into the world and intended to stay. Clara gasped, her body shaking with exhaustion and relief, as Jed wrapped the small red bundle in clean cloth and placed her in Clara's arms. "A girl," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion he hadn't expected to feel. "She's strong." Clara looked down at her daughter not her shame or her burden, but her child, and felt something shift in her chest, like a key turning in a lock. The baby was perfect, from her tiny fingernails to the dark hair that lay damp against her skull. Her eyes were open, blinking owlishly in the lamplight, and when Clara spoke her name, the baby seemed to listen. "Rose," Clara whispered. "Her name is Rose." Outside, the storm was ending, and the first gray light of dawn was beginning to seep through the cracks in the barn walls. But inside their small circle of warmth and lamplight, something had been born that was stronger than wind or cold or the judgments of narrow-minded people. 2 weeks after Rose's birth, the weather had turned deceptively mild, as if the early blizzard had been winter's warning shot rather than its opening salvo. Clara had recovered her strength with the resilience of youth and necessity, and baby Rose had settled into the rhythms of eating and sleeping that govern all new life. The little family, for that's what they had become, though none of them had spoken the word aloud, had found a tentative peace in their shared routines. Jed had moved his bedroll to the main room, giving Clara and the baby the privacy they needed, while remaining close enough to help during the night feedings. He carved a cradle from pine and cedar, sanding it smooth as silk and lining it with soft flannel that had once been part of his wife's wedding dress. When Clara protested that it was too precious to cut up, he simply said, "Mary would have wanted it used for its proper purpose." The baby thrived, growing plumper and more alert with each passing day. Her cries had lost the desperate edge of a creature fighting for survival and taken on the imperious tone of someone who expected her demands to be met promptly. She had wrapped both adults around her tiny finger, without effort reducing Jed to making funny faces to earn her smiles, and causing Clara to spend long minutes simply watching her sleep. It was during one of these peaceful moments Clara, nursing Rose by the kitchen window, while Jed repaired a broken harness at the table, that disaster announced itself with a sound like thunder rolling across the valley. But it wasn't thunder. It was hoofbeats coming fast and hard from the direction of town. Jed was on his feet instantly, his hand moving to the rifle that leaned against the doorframe. Through the window they could see a rider approaching at a gallop, his horse lathered with sweat and foam flying from its mouth. Behind him, a column of smoke rose into the afternoon sky like a black pillar reaching toward heaven. The rider pulled up in the yard with a spray of gravel, and Clara recognized him as Tommy Fletcher, the youngest son of the family that ran the livery stable in town. His face was streaked with soot, and his clothes reeked of smoke. "Fire!" he shouted before Jed could even open the door. "The whole North Range is burning. Started at the Hendricks place and jumped the fire break. Wind's pushing it this way fast." Jed was already moving, grabbing supplies and shoving them into grain sacks. "How much time?" he called over his shoulder. "Hour, maybe less." Tommy replied, his horse dancing nervously beneath him. "Maybe more if the wind shifts, but I wouldn't count on it. Most folks are heading for the river bottoms, but that's a hard ride for—" His eyes fell on Clara and the baby, and his voice trailed off. Clara felt ice form in her stomach. The river bottoms were 15 miles of hard riding over rough country, impossible for a woman barely 2 weeks past childbirth, carrying a newborn. She looked at Jed, saw the calculations running behind his eyes, and knew what he was thinking. "There's the old mining shack up in Devil's Canyon," she said quietly. "Stone Wall's good water source. It's only 3 miles. Jed nodded grimly. "Stone won't burn, and the canyon's usually wet this time of year. It's our best chance." He turned to Tommy Fletcher. "You tell everyone in town that we're heading for Devil's Canyon. If anyone comes looking after the fire passes, that's where we'll be." Tommy nodded and wheeled his horse around, already spurring toward the next homestead to spread the warning. As his hoofbeats faded, Clara and Jed began the desperate work of preparation. There was no time to save everything they packed, only the essentials: food, water, blankets, medical supplies, and the few precious items that couldn't be replaced. As they worked, the smell of smoke grew stronger, and ash began to fall like gray snow. In the distance, they could see the fire's glow painting the horizon orange and red. It moved like a living thing, consuming everything in its path with voracious hunger. Jed hitched the wagon with practiced efficiency, loading their supplies, while Clara wrapped Rose in layers of blankets to protect her from the smoke and cold. The baby sensed the adult's urgency and began to fuss, her cries adding to the chaos of evacuation. They left the homestead just as the wind shifted, bringing with it the roar of flames, and the acrid smell of burning timber. Clara looked back once at the cabin that had been her sanctuary, wondering if she would ever see it again. Then she turned her face forward and held her daughter close, focusing on survival rather than loss. The trail to Devil's Canyon wound through stands of pine and aspen that provided some protection from the wind, but also posed their own danger. If the fire reached the trees before they cleared them, they would be trapped in a tunnel of flame. Jed drove the wagon as fast as he dared over the rough ground, the horses snorting and shying at the smell of smoke. Halfway to the canyon, Clara felt the first contraction. At first, she thought it was just the jouncing of the wagon, or perhaps a cramp from holding Rose so tightly. But when the pain came again, sharper and more insistent, she knew with sinking certainty what was happening. "Jed," she said quietly, not wanting to add to his burden but knowing she had to speak. "What is it?" he asked, not taking his eyes from the treacherous path ahead. I think the baby's coming." His hands tightened on the reins, but he didn't slow the wagon. "How sure are you?" Another contraction answered for her, doubling her over and forcing a cry from her lips that had nothing to do with the smoke stinging her throat. Rose began to wail in response to her mother's distress, her small voice almost lost in the growing roar of the approaching fire. "Very sure," Clara gasped when she could speak again. Jed drove the wagon harder, pushing the horses to their limit. Behind them, the fire had reached the tree line, and individual pines were exploding into torches that lit the sky. Ahead, the canyon mouth yawned like a gateway to safety, but it seemed impossibly far away. They reached the mining shack just as the fire crested the ridge behind them. The old stone building squatted in the canyon like a toad, ugly, but solid, its walls blackened by decades of wind and weather. Jed unhitched the horses and drove them into the stone corral that the miners had built to hold their mules, then carried Clara inside while she clutched Rose to her chest. The shack was a single room with a dirt floor and walls thick enough to stop rifle bullets. A natural spring bubbled up in one corner, providing fresh water, and the previous occupants had left behind some basic furniture, a rough table, a few chairs, and a narrow bed frame that sagged under the weight of a straw mattress. Jed laid Clara on the bed and immediately began examining her with the same competent hands that had delivered Rose 2 weeks earlier. His face was grim in the flickering light of the oil lamp he had lit. "It's too soon," he said. "The baby's not due for months yet." "Tell that to the baby," Clara replied through gritted teeth as another contraction seized her. "Something's wrong, Jed. This isn't like before." Outside, the fire roared past the canyon mouth like a freight train, filling the air with sparks and embers that glowed like fallen stars. The heat was intense, even through the thick stone walls, and sweat ran down their faces despite the October chill. For the next several hours, Clara fought a battle on 2 fronts, against the premature labor that threatened to take her second child, and against the despair that whispered she was cursed to lose everything she dared to love. Rose slept fitfully in the makeshift cradle Jed had fashioned from a wooden crate, seemingly unaware of the drama unfolding around her. Near midnight, when the fire had moved on, and left behind only the smell of smoke and the occasional shower of ash, Clara's labor reached its crisis. The baby was coming whether ready or not, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. "I can't do this again." Clara sobbed, her strength nearly gone. "I can't lose another one." "You're not going to lose anything," Jed said fiercely, his hands gentle but his voice hard as iron. "This baby is going to live, and so are you. Do you hear me?" The delivery was difficult and dangerous, complicated by the baby's early arrival and Clara's exhaustion. But when the first thin cry cut through the smoke-hazed air of the shack, it carried with it the same fierce determination that had marked Rose's birth. This child, too, intended to live. "Another girl," Jed said, wrapping the tiny infant in clean cloth. She was smaller than Rose had been, her skin translucent and delicate, but her lungs were strong and her grip firm when Clara offered her finger. "What will you call her?" Jed asked. Clara looked down at her second daughter, born in fire, delivered in stone, welcomed into a world that had tried its best to prevent her arrival, and smiled through her tears. "Hope," she said. "Her name is Hope." The 3 days they spent in the mining shack after Hope's birth were among the longest in Clara's life. The baby was too small, too early, struggling to nurse and maintain her body temperature, despite the warm blankets and constant attention. Clara barely slept, afraid that if she closed her eyes, the fragile new life might slip away like smoke through her fingers. Jed proved himself invaluable during those critical hours, using knowledge he had gained through bitter experience to help keep Hope alive. He showed Clara how to encourage the baby's nursing, how to keep her warm, using heated stones wrapped in cloth, and how to recognize the signs of distress that might indicate serious trouble. On the 4th day, when Hope had gained a little weight and seemed stronger, they ventured outside the shack for the first time since the fire. The sight that greeted them was both heartbreaking and strangely beautiful. The entire valley had been transformed into a moonscape of ash and charred timber, but already green shoots were beginning to push through the blackened soil. Life, it seemed, was determined to reclaim what fire had tried to destroy. The journey back to the homestead was slow and careful, with frequent stops to rest and check on both babies. When they finally topped the ridge that overlooked Jed's property, Clara held her breath, afraid of what they might find. The cabin still stood. The fire had swept around it like water around a stone, burning everything in its path, except for the small oasis where Jed had built his home. The outbuildings were gone, along with most of the fencing and all of the stored hay, but the house itself was untouched. It stood in the center of a circle of ash, like a miracle made of wood and stone. "How?" Clara breathed, unable to believe what she was seeing. Jed was quiet for a long moment, studying the impossible sight. Then he pointed to a series of shallow trenches that ran in concentric circles around the property, barely visible now under their coating of ash. "Fire breaks," he said. "I dug them after the big fire 5 years ago. Never thought they'd actually work." But Clara knew there was more to it than simple preparation. The pattern of the burn, the way the flames had parted around the homestead, suggested something beyond mere luck or good planning. It was as if the land itself had decided to spare this small sanctuary, this place where hope had been reborn from despair. They settled back into the cabin with the strange feeling of people returning from the dead. The house was exactly as they had left it. Clara's sewing still sitting beside her chair, Jed's coffee cup still on the kitchen table, Rose's cradle still positioned to catch the morning light. But everything felt different now, charged with new meaning by what they had survived together. That evening, as Clara nursed Hope, while Rose slept peacefully in her cradle, Jed sat by the fire whittling a second, smaller cradle. The silence between them was comfortable, now filled with shared understanding rather than mutual wariness. "The town will have questions," Clara said quietly, breaking the companionable quiet. "Let them question," Jed replied without looking up from his work. "We know the truth." "Do we?" Clara asked. "What is the truth?" "Jed, what are we to each other?" He set down his whittling knife and looked at her directly for the first time since they had returned home. His pale blue eyes held depths she was only beginning to understand. "I bought you from your mother because I was tired of being alone with my ghosts," he said. "I thought maybe if I had someone living in the house the silence wouldn't be so loud. But you weren't what I expected." "What did you expect?" "Someone broken. Someone who would be grateful for scraps and ask for nothing more." His voice was quiet but steady. "Instead, I got someone who was bent but not broken. Someone who fought back against the world even when it tried to destroy her." Clara felt tears prick her eyes. "I was broken, Jed. I am broken." "No," he said firmly. "Broken things don't give birth to hope in the middle of a fire. Broken things don't name their children after flowers and possibilities. You're scarred, Clara, but scars are proof that you survived." The weight of his words settled between them like a bridge being built, plank by plank, across the chasm of their separate sorrows. Winter came early and hard that year, as if the fire had burned away autumn's buffer against the cold. By November, snow lay 3 feet deep across the valley, and the temperature rarely rose above freezing during the short daylight hours. The isolation that had once felt threatening now became protective, wrapping the small family in a cocoon of white silence that muffled the outside world. Clara thrived in the enforced solitude. Both babies were healthy and growing, Rose developing into a curious, active child who babbled constantly and hope slowly catching up, despite her premature arrival. The daily routines of caring for them, managing the household, and helping Jed with the winter chores filled Clara's days with purpose she had never known before. She learned to milk the cow to gather eggs despite the chicken's resentment of the cold, and to bake bread that rose properly in Jed's temperamental oven. In the evenings, while the babies slept, she taught herself to read from Mary's books, sounding out words by lamplight, while Jed carved toys and furniture from seasoned pine. But even the deepest winter cannot last forever, and when the spring thaw finally came in March, it brought visitors along with the wildflowers. The first was Dr. Samuel Morrison, the territory's circuit physician, who arrived on a sturdy bay gelding with medical bags tied to his saddle. He was a small, neat man with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles, and he had ridden 20 miles through mud and melting snow to check on reports he had heard in town. "I heard there were 2 births during the fire," he said without preamble when Jed answered the door. "Thought I should examine the babies, make sure they're developing properly." Clara's first instinct was to hide, to bundle the girls into the back room and pretend they weren't there. But Jed stepped aside to let the doctor enter, and something in his manner, calm, confident, protective, gave her courage. Dr. Morrison examined both babies with gentle competence, pronouncing them healthy and well cared for, despite the unusual circumstances of their births. He spent extra time with Hope checking her breathing and muscle tone, but seemed satisfied with what he found. "Remarkable," he said as he packed his instruments. "Premature babies rarely thrive as well as this one has. You've done excellent work, Mrs." He paused, waiting for Clara to supply a name. The moment stretched between them heavy with implications. Clara glanced at Jed, who was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Coulter," she said quietly. "Mrs. Coulter." The doctor nodded, as if he had expected nothing else. "Well, Mrs. Coulter, you have 2 beautiful, healthy daughters. You should be very proud." After he left Clara, and Jed didn't speak about her claiming his name. But that evening, as they sat by the fire with the babies sleeping nearby, he reached over and took her hand in his work-roughened fingers. "Are you sure?" he asked. "About what?" "About taking my name, about staying, about all of it." Clara looked around the cabin that had become home at the cradles he had built with his own hands, at the man who had saved her life, and the lives of her children without asking for anything in return. "I'm sure," she said. The wedding was a simple affair conducted by the traveling preacher who made his rounds through the territory twice a year. They were married in the cabin's front room on a Sunday morning in April, with only Dr. Morrison and his wife as witnesses. Clara wore Mary's wedding dress, altered to fit her figure, and carried a bouquet of the first wildflowers of spring. Jed's kiss was gentle, tentative, as if he were afraid she might change her mind at the last moment. But Clara kissed him back, with all the gratitude and growing affection in her heart, sealing their union, not just legally, but emotionally. The news of their marriage spread through the territory like wildfire, carried by gossipy tongues and embellished with each telling. Some of the stories were merely unkind speculation about Clara's past and Jed's motives, but others were vicious, painting Clara as a scheming seductress who had trapped a grieving widower, or Jed as a man who preyed on desperate women. Sarah Blackwood led the chorus of disapproval, making pointed comments about certain people who didn't know their place and decent folks who had to watch their reputations being dragged through the mud by association. She organized a letter-writing campaign to the territorial governor, demanding an investigation into Jed's immoral behavior. But for every voice raised in condemnation, Another spoke in defense. Dr. Morrison publicly praised Clara's care of her premature daughter and Jed's heroism during the fire. The Fletcher family, whose son had carried the fire warning, invited the new family to Sunday dinner and made it clear they considered Clara and the babies welcome additions to the community. Most surprisingly, several other women came forward with their own stories of difficult beginnings and second chances. Martha Henderson confessed that she had been pregnant when she married her husband, a scandal that had been carefully hidden for 30 years. Young Mrs. Patterson admitted that her first child had been fathered by a man other than her husband, a secret she had carried alone, until Clara's courage gave her strength to speak. Gradually, the community began to divide into two camps, those who believed in redemption and second chances, and those who preferred their neighbors to remain properly ashamed of their past mistakes. The division was not always predictable, cutting across family lines and social boundaries in ways that surprised everyone. By the summer of 1888, Clara had been Mrs. Jed Coulter for 4 months, and the change in her circumstances was nothing short of miraculous. The frightened, desperate girl, who had been sold like livestock behind Murphy's store, had been replaced by a confident young woman who managed a household, raised 2 healthy daughters, and worked alongside her husband to build something lasting from the ashes of their separate sorrows. The homestead itself reflected their transformation. Jed had rebuilt the burned outbuildings with Clara's help, and together they had planted a large garden that now provided vegetables for their table and extras to sell in town. Clara had insisted on roses along the front fence, and despite Jed's skepticism about their chances in the harsh prairie soil, the bushes had not only survived, but thrived. Rose, now walking and chattering in a mixture of real words and delightful gibberish, had become the unofficial mascot of their small community. She would toddle around the yard collecting flowers and rocks, and anything else that caught her fancy, presenting her treasures to anyone who would admire them. Hope, though still smaller than her sister, was developing her own personality, quieter than Rose, but intensely observant with eyes that seemed to take in everything around her. The success of their unconventional family had not gone unnoticed, and gradually other young women in difficult circumstances began to find their way to the Coulter homestead. Some came seeking advice, others looking for temporary refuge, and a few stayed long enough to help with the harvest or the canning before moving on to new lives. Clara discovered that she had a gift for listening without judging, and offering practical help without condescension. She taught young mothers how to care for sick children, showed unmarried girls how to make their own way in the world, and provided a safe space for women to speak truths they couldn't share anywhere else. Jed supported these efforts without complaint, often working extra hours to make up for the resources Clara shared with their temporary guests. He built additional sleeping space in the barn loft and quietly increased the size of their garden to feed the extra mouths that came to their table. One evening in late July, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains purple and gold, Clara broached a subject that had been growing in her mind for weeks. "I want to start a school," she said. Jed looked up from the leather harness he was mending. "A school for the children around here. Rose will need education soon, and so will Hope. But the nearest school is in town, and that's too far for the little ones. Besides, some of the families can't afford to send their children, or they need them to work." Jed was quiet for a moment, considering. "Where would you hold it? We could build a small schoolhouse on the back 40. Nothing fancy, just one room with desks and a blackboard. I could teach reading, writing, arithmetic, maybe some geography and history." "Can you teach?" Jed asked, not doubting her ability, but genuinely curious about her qualifications. Clara smiled. "I've been teaching myself from Mary's books all winter, and before my mother decided I was more valuable as a tavern girl, I was the best student in our one-room school back in Kansas. The teacher, Miss Anderson, used to say I had a natural gift for explaining things so others could understand." The idea grew over the following weeks, fueled by conversations with other parents and encouragement from unlikely sources. Dr. Morrison offered to donate medical texts and teach basic health lessons once a month. The Patterson family promised lumber at cost, and several neighbors volunteered labor for the construction. Even some of Clara's former critics came around when they realized the school would benefit their own children. Sarah Blackwood remained stubbornly opposed, but her influence was waning as more people witnessed the positive changes Clara had brought to the community. Construction began in August, with the entire community contributing in various ways. The men provided muscle and carpentry skills, the women organized food for the workers and sewed curtains and cushions, and the children helped by fetching tools and staying out of the way. Clara found herself at the center of it all, planning lessons, organizing supplies, and coordinating the various volunteer efforts. She discovered that she had a talent for leadership, born perhaps from years of having to think quickly and act decisively to survive. The schoolhouse was completed just before the first snowfall, a simple but sturdy building with large windows to let in natural light and a pot-bellied stove to provide warmth during the winter months. Clara had insisted on painting it yellow, declaring that children needed bright colors to inspire their imaginations. The first day of school arrived on a crisp October morning with 15 students ranging in age from 5 to 14. Clara stood in front of her new classroom, wearing a dress of deep blue wool that Jed had bought for her in town, her hair pinned up in a neat bun that made her look older and more authoritative. She had prepared for this moment for months, but as she looked out at the eager faces before her, she felt a familiar flutter of nervousness. These children were depending on her to give them the tools they would need to build better lives than their parents had known. It was a responsibility she didn't take lightly. "Good morning, students," she said, her voice carrying clearly to the back of the room. "Welcome to Coulter School. My name is Mrs. Coulter, and I'm going to be your teacher." A small boy in the front row raised his hand. "Yes, Timothy. My ma says you used to be a bad woman. Is that true?" A silence fell over the classroom, like a blanket. Clara felt her cheeks burn, but she had learned to face uncomfortable truths with grace and honesty. "I made some mistakes when I was younger," she said calmly. "But making mistakes doesn't make someone a bad person. It makes them human. What matters is what we do after we make mistakes. Do we learn from them and try to do better, or do we let them define us for the rest of our lives?" Timothy considered this seriously. "I think we should try to do better." "I think so too," Clara agreed. "Now let's begin with reading. Who can tell me what sound this letter makes?" As the morning progressed, Clara's nervousness faded, replaced by the joy of watching young minds engage with new ideas. She had found her calling at last, and it felt as natural as breathing. 2 years passed in what felt like a golden dream. The school flourished with enrollment growing each term as word spread about the quality of education Clara provided. She had expanded the curriculum to include music and art, teaching the children songs and showing them how to capture the beauty of their mountain landscape in simple drawings. Rose had become one of her star pupils despite her young age displaying the same quick mind and determined spirit that had helped her survive her dramatic birth. Hope, though still quiet by nature, showed remarkable artistic talent and often spent her free time creating detailed sketches of wildflowers and animals. The Coulter homestead had grown as well, with additional buildings and improved land that reflected years of hard work and careful planning. Jed had proven to be not just a provider, but a true partner supporting Clara's educational work, while building his own reputation as a fair dealer and skilled craftsman. Their marriage had deepened from convenience and mutual respect into genuine love, the kind that grows slowly rooted in shared struggles and daily kindnesses rather than passion alone. They were content with each other, comfortable in ways that neither had thought possible during their years of solitude and sorrow. But contentment, Clara had learned, was a fragile thing in the American West, where the past had a way of arriving uninvited just when you thought you had outrun it. He came on a Tuesday afternoon in late spring, riding a flashy sorrel gelding, and dressed in the kind of expensive clothes that marked him as someone with money and opinions about how it should be spent. Clara was teaching her afternoon reading class when she heard the hoofbeats in the yard. But she didn't look up from the lesson until one of the older boys whistled low under his breath. "Teacher, you better come see this." Clara moved to the window and felt her blood turn to ice water in her veins. The man dismounting from the sorrel was older than she remembered, with silver threads in his dark hair and lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent in the sun. But she would have recognized Marcus Ashford anywhere, even if she had lived to be 100. He was Hope's father. Clara's hands trembled as she dismissed the children early, sending them home with instructions to practice their letters and promising to make up the lost time tomorrow. She watched from the schoolhouse window as Marcus approached the main house, his stride confident and proprietary in a way that made her stomach clench with old fear. Jed met him on the porch, the two men facing each other like gunfighters, measuring distance and advantage. Clara couldn't hear their words from where she stood, but she could see the tension in their postures, the careful way they kept their hands visible and away from their weapons. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, Jed nodded toward the schoolhouse. Marcus looked in her direction, and even across the distance, Clara felt the impact of his gaze like a physical blow. She had no choice but to walk across the yard and face the man who had once meant everything to her, and then abandoned her when she needed him most. "Hello, Clara," Marcus said when she reached the porch. His voice was the same warm, cultured, with just a hint of the southern accent he had never quite lost. "You look well. What do you want, Marcus?" Clara asked, surprised by how steady her own voice sounded. "I want to meet my daughter," he replied simply. "And I want to discuss our future." Clara felt Jed move closer to her side, his presence solid and reassuring. "We don't have a future," she said. "That ended 2 years ago when you disappeared." Marcus's smile was the same charming expression that had once made her heart race. Now it just made her tired. "I had business to attend to, family obligations. But I'm here now, and I'm prepared to do right by you and the child." "Her name is Hope," Clara said, "and you're 2 years too late to do right by anyone." "I have money now," Marcus continued as if she hadn't spoken. "Real money, not just the small-time investments I was working with before. I can give you a proper life, Clara. A house in San Francisco, servants, fine clothes. The child can have the best education money can buy." "She's getting an excellent education right here," Jed said quietly, speaking for the first time since Clara had joined them. "From her mother." Marcus looked at Jed, as if noticing him for the first time. "And you are?" "Her husband," Jed replied, his voice carrying a subtle warning. "And Hope's father in every way that matters." "Legally, perhaps," Marcus said with dismissive confidence, "but blood is blood and I have rights." "You have nothing," Clara said, surprised by the anger in her voice. "You lost any rights you might have had when you walked away without a word. Hope doesn't know you, doesn't need you, and doesn't want you." Marcus's facade of charm slipped slightly. "She's my child, Clara, my blood. You can't keep her from me." "I can and I will," Clara replied. "You're not her father, you're just the man who helped make her. There's a difference." The confrontation might have escalated into something uglier, but Hope chose that moment to come running around the corner of the house, her arms full of wildflowers, and her face bright with the joy of a 3-year-old who had found something wonderful to share. She stopped when she saw the strange man on the porch, suddenly shy, and moved to Clara's side. "Mom, I picked flowers for the table," she said, holding up her colorful bouquet. Clara knelt down to her daughter's level, accepting the flowers with appropriate ceremony. "They're beautiful, sweetheart. Why don't you go put them in water? I'll be in to help you arrange them in a minute." Hope nodded and skipped towards the house, pausing only to smile at Jed, who ruffled her hair affectionately. She didn't spare Marcus so much as a glance. "She doesn't even look like me," Marcus said, and Clara could hear the surprise in his voice. "She looks like herself," Clara replied, standing up, "which is all that matters." Marcus studied Hope's retreating figure with the expression of a man trying to solve a difficult puzzle. Clara could see him taking in the child's obvious health and happiness, her comfortable familiarity with Jed, her complete lack of interest in the stranger who claimed to be her father. "I could go to court," he said finally, but the threat sounded hollow even to him. "You could try," Jed said mildly. "But you'd have to prove paternity first, and then you'd have to convince a judge that it would be in the child's best interest to remove her from the only family she's ever known. That's assuming, of course, that you want your business associates in San Francisco to know about your past indiscretions." Marcus's face flushed red. "Are you threatening me?" "I'm stating facts," Jed replied. "Clara is my wife, Hope is my legally adopted daughter, and you are a stranger with no claim on either of them. Any attempt to change that situation would likely result in publicity you probably don't want." The two men stared at each other for a long moment, the air between them crackling with tension. Clara held her breath, afraid that one of them would push the confrontation past the point of no return. Finally, Marcus stepped back. "This isn't over," he said, but the words lacked conviction. "Yes, it is," Clara said firmly. "It was over the day you chose your reputation over your responsibility. Go back to San Francisco, Marcus. Build your empire, marry your society girl, have legitimate children you can acknowledge. But leave us alone." Marcus looked as if he wanted to argue, but something in Clara's expression, perhaps the quiet strength she had gained through years of struggle, or the absolute certainty in her voice, seemed to convince him that further protest would be futile. He mounted his sorrel without another word, and rode away at a trot, his expensive clothes and flashy horse looking somehow shabby and pretentious in the simple honesty of the mountain landscape. Clara watched until he disappeared around the bend in the road, then sagged against Jed's solid warmth. She had faced down her past and won, but the victory felt exhausting rather than triumphant. "Are you all right?" Jed asked softly. "I am," Clara said, and realized she meant it. "I really am." That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Hope climbed into Clara's lap, and Rose leaned against Jed's knee. The mountains stood eternal and beautiful against the darkening sky, and somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark sang its liquid song to the emerging stars. "Tell us a story," Mama Rose requested, as she did every evening. Clara smiled and began the tale they all loved best, the story of two little girls who were born in extraordinary circumstances and grew up in a magical place where love was stronger than fear, and hope could bloom even in the harshest ground. As she spoke, she felt the last shadows of her old life slip away like morning mist before the sun. She was no longer the desperate girl who had been sold behind a store, or the frightened young woman who had faced childbirth alone in a barn. She was Clara Coulter, teacher, and mother, wife, and friend, a woman who had built something beautiful from the ashes of what others had tried to destroy. Epilogue: The Blooming. 10 years had passed since that spring confrontation with Marcus Ashford, and the Coulter homestead had become the unofficial heart of their growing community. The yellow schoolhouse now had 2 rooms and served 38 students, with Clara training younger women to help with the teaching. Rose, at 13, had inherited her mother's gift for education and often helped with the younger children, while Hope, 11, illustrated the textbooks with drawings so detailed and beautiful that a publisher in Denver had expressed interest in her work. Jed had been elected to the Territorial Council, where his reputation for fairness and common sense made him a respected voice in the region's growing political importance. Talk of statehood filled the newspapers, and everyone agreed that when Montana finally joined the Union men, like Jed Coulter would be the ones to guide its future. The rose bushes along the front fence had grown into a magnificent hedge that bloomed spectacularly each June, drawing visitors from miles around to see what many called the most beautiful garden in the territory. Clara had added other flowers over the years: sweet peas and hollyhocks, delphiniums and daisies, creating a riot of color that seemed to celebrate the abundance that had grown from such austere beginnings. But the roses remained the centerpiece, their pink and white blooms opening toward the sun with the same stubborn determination that had characterized their planting. They had indeed grown where no one thought they could, thriving in soil that had once known only sorrow and neglect. On a warm evening in early summer, Clara stood among her flowers with her newest daughter cradled in her arms. Little Mary, named for the woman whose bedroom had become a nursery, once again was only 3 months old, but she had already shown signs of the strong will that seemed to run in all the Coulter women. Rose and Hope played in the yard, with several neighbor children, their laughter mixing with the evening song of birds settling into their roosts. Jed sat on the porch steps, whittling a new toy for the baby, while keeping one eye on the children's games. The scene was so perfect, so utterly peaceful, that Clara almost couldn't believe it was real. Sometimes she still woke in the night, heart pounding, afraid that she would find herself back in that cramped room behind Murphy's store, that everything good in her life had been nothing but a desperate dream. But then she would hear Jed's steady breathing beside her, feel the weight of whichever baby was sleeping between them, and know that this life, this beautiful, impossible life, was real and solid and hers. A rider appeared on the horizon, approaching at an easy lope that suggested a social visit rather than an emergency. As he drew closer, Clara recognized Dr. Morrison, now graying at the temples, but still making his rounds to check on his scattered patients. "Evening, Clara," he called as he dismounted. "Thought I'd stop by and see how young Mary is getting along." "She's thriving," Clara replied, adjusting the baby's blanket. "Growing like a weed and eating like a lumberjack." Dr. Morrison chuckled as he examined the infant with gentle, experienced hands. "She's perfect," he pronounced. "Absolutely perfect. You and Jed make beautiful babies." The casual assumption in his words that all 3 girls were equally Jed's daughters warmed Clara's heart. Hope's paternity had become ancient history relevant to no one except the people who loved her. She was a Coulter in every way that mattered, and the community had long since forgotten or chosen to ignore the circumstances of her birth. As Dr. Morrison prepared to leave, he paused beside Clara in the garden. "I hope you know what you've accomplished here," he said quietly. "When I first met you, you were a frightened girl with no prospects and 2 babies who might not survive. Now look at you, teacher, mother pillar of the community. You've built something remarkable." Clara looked around at her domain. The thriving homestead, the successful school, the children playing in the yard, the man on the porch who had given her not just his name, but his unwavering support and love. It was indeed remarkable, but not in the way Dr. Morrison meant. "I didn't build this alone," she said. "None of us did. It took a whole community to create this life, and it takes all of us to sustain it." Dr. Morrison smiled and mounted his horse. "That's what makes it so special," he said. "You didn't just save yourself, Clara. You saved all of us by showing us what was possible." As the doctor rode away, Jed joined Clara among the roses, slipping his arm around her waist and looking down at their youngest daughter with the expression of wonder that still crossed his face whenever he held one of his children. "She's going to be beautiful," he said softly. "She already is," Clara replied. "They all are." Rose came running over her face, flushed with play, and her hair escaping from its braid. "Mama Hope says she wants to write a book about our family. Can she really do that?" Clara smiled at her oldest daughter, the child who had been born in desperation and had grown into confidence and joy. "She can do anything she sets her mind to," she said. "All of you can." As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold that matched the flowers in Clara's garden, the family gathered on the porch for their evening ritual. Jed brought out his fiddle, and Clara led them in the songs she had learned from Mary's hymnal, and the children had learned in their school. Their voices rose together into the cooling air, carrying across the valley like a benediction. Other families, hearing the music, stepped onto their own porches to listen, and soon the entire community was connected by the simple, beautiful act of shared song. In that moment, Clara understood something fundamental about the nature of hope. It wasn't a thing you could plant like a seed and expect to grow on its own. Hope required tending, nurturing, protecting from the storms that would inevitably come. But when it was properly cared for, when it was surrounded by love and sustained by community hope, could bloom into something magnificent. Something that would spread its seeds far beyond the original garden, creating new possibilities in places where none had existed before. The roses would bloom again next summer, and the summer after that, and for all the summers to come. Children would learn to read in the yellow schoolhouse, and some of them would grow up to become teachers themselves, carrying Clara's methods and philosophy to other communities that needed what she had learned to give. Hope would indeed write her book, and Rose would establish schools across the new state of Montana, and little Mary would become a doctor like the kind man who had delivered her. The Coulter legacy would spread like wildflower seeds on the wind, taking root wherever they found fertile ground. But that was still in the future. For now there was just this perfect evening, this moment of peace and plenty that had grown from the ashes of despair. Clara held her baby close and listened to her family's voices blending with the evening breeze, knowing that she had found what she had been searching for all her life without even knowing she was looking for it. She had found home. If this tale of frontier redemption stirred something deep in your heart, if you felt the quiet strength of a man who learned to love again, witnessed the fierce resilience of a woman who refused to be defined by her past, and marveled at the miracle of hope blooming in the most unlikely soil, then you understand the true spirit of the American West. This is more than just a story of romance and survival. It's a testament to the power of second chances, the strength that grows from community, and the truth that our past mistakes don't have to determine our future possibilities. Clara and Jed's journey reminds us that love isn't always about grand gestures and passionate declarations. Sometimes it's found in the quiet moments, in the daily choice to stand by someone through their struggles, and in the courage to build something beautiful together from whatever materials life provides. The frontier wasn't just a place, it was a state of mind, a willingness to believe that beyond the next ridge lay possibilities that didn't exist in the settled, civilized world. It was the understanding that in vast, open country, people could reinvent themselves, could become more than what circumstances had made them, could plant gardens in ground that had never known flowers. We may no longer have a geographical frontier, but we still have the capacity for that frontier spirit. We can still choose to see potential instead of problems, to offer second chances instead of permanent judgment, to build communities that nurture growth instead of punishing failure. Clara's roses bloomed because she believed they could, because she was willing to plant them in ground that others had written off as barren, because she understood that some of the most beautiful things in life grow from soil that has been enriched by struggle and loss. What roses are you afraid to plant? What dreams have you dismissed as impossible because the ground seems too hard, the climate too harsh, the odds too long? What second chances are you waiting to give to others or to yourself? The American West teaches us that transformation is always possible, that communities can be built from the most unlikely collection of people, and that hope is the most powerful force in the human arsenal when properly cultivated and shared. Share this story with someone who needs to believe in second chances. Let it remind you that no matter how barren your current circumstances might seem, there's always the possibility of growth, always the chance that something beautiful might take root and flourish. Like Clara's roses, the best things in life often bloom where no one expects them to, tended by hands that refuse to give up, nurtured by hearts that choose hope over despair. The frontier may be closed, but the frontier spirit lives on in every person who chooses to plant roses in difficult ground and tends them with the patient faith that spring will always come again. Plant your roses, tend them well, and watch for the bloom.